Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the Briefing Room, and this week I shall be talking to Stephen Harding, who's going to be talking about his book, The Last Battle. Now, this is a story I've never heard before from World War II. It's about the US and German soldiers fighting side by side against the advancing SS. So it should be another fascinating conversation. So, as always, don't forget to like and subscribe. And I'll see you on the other side. For now, history. Well, Stephen Harding, welcome to the Briefing Room. Today we're going to be talking about your book, The Last Battle. And I'll put a link for everybody down below to get a hold of that. That was very, very interesting. I'd never heard that story before. And it was really interesting. And it read like a movie script. Was that your intention from the beginning?
It was, and first of all, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, welcome.
Yeah, as a writer, I've written pretty much everything you can write, including training films, speeches, everything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I am by training and career a military journalist. I have a couple of degrees in history with specialization in the history of World War II. For a while, was a staff historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History. And while I was working there, this was in the early 80s, there was a wonderful man, Professor Fred Beck, who knew everything about World War II history, literally everything,
Yeah.
and spoke fluent German. And he had been researching for a while this odd little story that he used to talk to me about this castle in Austria that was jointly defended by German and American troops. And I thought, well, that sounds like a great story. And then he got busy with a whole bunch of other projects. And one day he came into me and said, "Hey, would you like this material?" And I said, "Sure, of course I would." So he gave me a box of research documents he'd been able to find and stuff. And then I ended up putting it away for 30 years because life intervened.
Yeah.
And what really attracted me to the story, I like to write books that focus on relatively small groups of people. But that story, I like to have illustrate a larger aspect of World War II, because we've seen all the, well, not all, but most of the really big stories, the D-Day landings, Dieppe, all of those things. I'm interested in the smaller stories. So he was telling me about a small group of American soldiers who just happened to be in the right place at the literally in the last days of the war in Europe, who were asked by a German officer to help rescue these irascible French VIP prisoners in this castle. And I spent 5 years working in Germany, um, which ended in 1989 when I came back to the United States, right before the Berlin Wall fell. But while I was in Germany, I managed to do a lot more research. I visited some of the sites. So I came back and I went to work for Soldiers Magazine, which is much like the British Army's Soldier. It's
Yeah.
the military forces magazine. And I ended up going back to Germany at least twice a year for the next 20 years. So I had a really good opportunity to really research the story. I was able to find the last surviving American participants in the story. And then I found the son of the key German participant. So
Oh,
it
wow.
all sort of came together at that point. And then I had to write the book. But because I grew up in Southern California, and all of my friends' parents were in the TV and movie business, not as actors, but as writers or sound technicians. And I meant this book to be a movie, so it's sort of written in scenes, and
Yeah, yeah.
that's kind of how that all came about.
And what was it like meeting the people who'd actually been there?
It was amazing.
Mm.
The two Americans I met were both at the time of this battle in May 1945. They were you know, 20-year-old infantrymen
Yeah.
uh, who really just wanted to stay alive. Everybody knew the war was almost over. And these guys got volunteered to go along to the castle. And all they were thinking about is, as they both told me at that time, that, they didn't want to be the last guy killed in World War II. But they ended up in this, pretty major firefight. And both of these gentlemen were, throughout the battle, literally 10 feet apart.
Mhm.
But each one of them, the story they told me sounded like a completely different battle from what the other gentleman told me. And having been in combat zones, and you tend to get very focused when people are shooting at or near you. You're very focused.
Yeah.
But they were obviously right there. The eyewitness accounts were just amazing. What they saw the key German leader and the key American leader doing, and what they saw the French VIPs doing during
Mm.
this fight. It was stuff that you would never have found anywhere except you would have never gotten it except from an eyewitness. Sadly, they both passed away several years ago. And then during the process, the key German commander in this fight was a guy named Josef Gongel. He was known as Sepp. Sepp is a very common German nickname if your
Yeah.
name is Joseph. And he's the one who brought the Americans together and fought with them. And I found his son, who had never met his father. His father, he didn't get a chance to talk to his father. Let's say
Mm.
that.
Yeah.
But he had a lot of papers that, again, I never would have found even in the German archives, because I did search, the Bundesarchiv and the Militärarchiv very thoroughly, and I never would have found the information I found from him. So it was wonderful to be able to connect with these people, especially the two American GIs, because they were a direct link to what I was writing about. And because I had been to the castle, um, briefly, and I wasn't allowed into the castle because the gentleman who owns it now doesn't want to have anything to do with the story. But I was able to find blueprints of what the castle looked like in
Mm.
1945 at the mayor's office in the little village of Itter, and he happily shared everything with me. So I could
Wow.
visualize not only where these two guys were, but where everybody was during the fight. It was totally necessary and valuable information.
Well, that's amazing that you found all that and you found the blueprints and everything. And I don't understand why the guy doesn't want to anything to do with the history of the place where he's living,
Um,
because that's an amazing story.
it is an amazing story. He, I think the best way to express it is his politics. Uh, he wasn't interested in telling the story,
Right.
and
Okay.
that's all I can really say about it. But my wife and I visited Itter in the process of writing this book. We got right up to the front gate. You could see the entire castle essentially from where we were.
Yeah.
And then we were told by a gardener that we couldn't come in because nobody was allowed. So we turned around, we were walking back through the village of Itter and literally ran into the mayor. And, uh, I told him what I was doing there, and he said, "Oh, I can show you blueprints." So he took me into his office and showed us blueprints and gave me the email address of the man in Vienna from whom we could get even better blueprints. And they sent them
Wow.
to me.
That's
So
amazing.
it was amazing because especially when you're writing about a contained firefight in a
Yeah.
building, you have to know where these people are, which floor, where the staircases are, and these blueprints provided all of that.
What I liked about your book is the Castle Itter becomes a character in itself.
Mhm.
And could you tell the listener a bit about the history of Castle Itter? Because I found that really fascinating.
It's a very interesting story. I mean, the castle sits on a promontory that overlooks the Brixental and Inn valleys in the Tyrol part of Austria. Those valleys have been a traditional invasion route since time began, really. The first fortification on that mountain was built, several hundred years ago. And over time, it was enlarged first as a real fortification, but then it became essentially a private home for very high-level individuals in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example. Ultimately, it became a sort of a boutique hotel. It was a private home several times. And the thing that I find really interesting is that after the Anschluss, when Germany absorbed Austria,
Mm.
the castle became the headquarters for the Nazi movement's anti-tobacco campaign. And I think, when we think of Nazis, we don't think of them as being anti-smoking, but of course Hitler was. Hitler was
Yeah.
virulently anti-smoking. So for about a year, the castle was the headquarters for the German anti-smoking campaign. They printed leaflets and pamphlets and so on. But as the war progressed, it was seen as the ideal sort of prison for very high value prisoners. In German, they're called Ehrenhäftlinge, or honor prisoners,
Mhm.
essentially. And these were prisoners that the Germans wanted to hold in case they could later be exchanged for high-level Allied prisoners, or Allied and German prisoners. And so it was turned into a prison. It was a subset of the concentration camp movement. And ultimately, 14 French people were imprisoned there. Very well-known, the former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, um, Edward Daladier, very high-level people. And they were imprisoned there by the Germans. And the real cruelty of the Germans, it was a very high-level prison. So
Mm.
these people had daily, rations of wine, cigarettes. There were 4 women imprisoned there who were allowed under guard to go into Itter and have their hair done. So we're not
Mm.
talking, Dachau,
Yeah.
but they also couldn't leave. There was barbed wire, machine guns, the whole 9 yards. Uh, the real cruelty of the Germans is these French VIPs, most of them hated each other. They were political rivals, personal enemies. So when they ate in their very nice little dining room, they sat on opposite sides of the room at different tables and basically hurled insults at each other. So although the surroundings were pleasant, probably the interactions were less so.
And even further back than that, the castle was home for artists and musicians, and
Oh, there was a very famous, several very famous musicians, writers. It was, at least in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was really a gathering place for for the artists and musicians of both Germany and the Austro-Hungarian
mm,
Empire. Sophie Mutter was a very well-known classical musician, and she owned the castle outright at one point. But, taking care, as we all know, of a simple home gets expensive. Taking care of a castle, especially one that
mm,
was largely built in the 16th century, that has its own special challenges. So she ended up having to sell it. And when it became a boutique hotel, the person who did that turned a lot of the essentially unused rooms in the castle into guest rooms, many of which had their own toiletries or toilets and so on. So when the Germans took it over and decided to turn it into a prison, they essentially already had pre-made cells. All they had to do was put locks on the doors.
mm. That's amazing that you've got an ensuite prison cell.
It's it's something that very few German prisoners got to experience.
And the Waffen SS began to attack Castle Itter on the 5th of May 1945. What was the initial response of the Americans there?
So leading up to that, in about the week before the actual battle for the castle began. The commandant of the castle, a guy named Sebastian Wimmer, a real nasty piece of work,
Mm.
former policeman who had helped in Poland. He helped set up Majdanek concentration camp. He was not a nice gentleman at all. He heard through the grapevine that Heinrich Himmler. Now, remember, by this point, Hitler is dead. Hitler's already
Yeah.
killed him. Everybody on both sides know that the war is essentially over. So Wimmer heard that Himmler had ordered elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. Gertz von Berlichen was the name of this organization. He had ordered them to go to the castle and kill everybody, not just the VIPs, but also any German guards or anybody else who was still there. So Wimmer and his subordinates and all the enlisted guards left as quickly as they could, which meant that the French VIPs were now in charge of it. They knew that there were Allied units in the area, American units in this case, and so they reached out to them because they needed help. But they also reached out to Sepp Gangl, who at that point was essentially the commander of the German forces in Kufstein and the little villages around it. He had already thrown himself in and his men in with the Austrian resistance. So he was providing the Austrian resistance with weapons. He was telling them when the Waffen SS or Gestapo were operating in the area, because they still were. And he wanted to save these VIPs. So he reached out to the advancing Americans to ask for help.
Mm.
And the people he came in contact with was a company of the 23rd Tank Battalion of the U.S. 12th Armored Division. And that company was led by a guy named Jack Lee, who was really the epitome of the hard charging tanker, chewed cigars,
Mm.
swore like a sailor, but he was very good at what he did. And, essentially on the 4th of May, uh, Lee and his unit are hunkered down in Kufstein because they've been told to hold in place because they're about to be replaced by elements of an infantry division. And here comes this German Kubelwagen with a big white flag and a
Mm.
German officer sitting in the back. And um, the Americans were a little tense because, again, nobody in that unit wanted to be the last person killed in World War II,
Yeah.
or at least in Europe. And but Jack Lee, he was one of those people who had found his niche as a combat tanker or a combat soldier of any kind. It's really the only thing he knew how to do. And he probably wasn't thinking all that positively about what would happen after the war because he had no other skills. I
Yeah.
mean, he'd been a soldier. So he and Sepp Gangl get together. Gangl tells him what's happening. Lee says, sure. While his soldiers are going, no, sir, we don't need to do this. But they did. Gangl and Lee jump in this Kubelwagen and followed by a truckload of German soldiers. They drive up to the castle, which is up on top of this promontory at the end of a long and very winding road. And they talk to the VIPs and say, look, we'll be back with more people. They drive back down the hill and they, put together this task force to then go up and rescue the VIPs.
Well, thank you very much for that detailed answer. Um, you mentioned Jack Lee and Joseph Gangl. What was the most, in your research, what was the most compelling thing you found about both of them?
I think it's because they were literally, although they were on different sides, they were both professional soldiers. For example, Gangl never joined the Nazi Party. And in fact, Gangl had joined the German army in the 1920s before Hitler came to power. And he eventually rose through the ranks to become an officer. Jack Lee was the son of a fairly prominent doctor in upstate New York. and Jack went to Norwich University, which is one of the American universities that uh, turns out American military officers. Um, and the two of them knew what their duty was. I mean, Jack Lee had fought the Canadians, the British, and the Americans. Sepp Gangle, sorry, had fought the Canadians, British, and Americans in Normandy, and did so rather effectively.
Mm.
Jack Lee, he and his men came ashore after the landings, but then had to fight their way from France through Germany and then into Austria. They had been in contact a lot. And Jack had shown himself to be a really excellent, not only a combat leader, but a guy that soldiers were willing to follow. You know, he was just a really good leader. So these two guys meet, and from everything I found out, they pretty quickly saw in each other aspects of themselves. You know,
Yeah.
it was kind of, you know, what had led up to that point for both of them, as the old saying goes, you know, it wasn't personal, it was just business. They were soldiers. They were fighting each other, but now they had the chance to come together and do good together, do something right. And they both saw it and they joined forces.
So just remaining professional all along the way.
Yeah, yeah. They, you know, I'm sure that especially once Gongel's, you know, dozen or so German soldiers and Lee's dozen or so American soldiers first came together, I would be willing to bet that the soldiers on both sides kept their fingers on their triggers or very
Yeah.
close. You know, it's that's the way that's the way people act in wartime. So, you know, I think it was initially a very wary. They were not entirely sure of each other, at least the men
Yeah.
weren't. But you know, Gongol and Lee said, "Okay, we're going to do this. How are we?" And they immediately got down to the tactical, you know, sort of nuts and bolts.
Mm.
Who are we going to take? What do we think we're going to run into? You know, the things that tactical leaders always think about. So, I just think I think eventually, although they only had less than 48 hours together, I think they became sort of wary friends, or at
Yeah.
least they respected each other.
Do you think that Seb Gamble, do you think that he helped the resistance because that was a moral choice, or do you think he was just saving his own neck?
Well, I think, you know, so this all happened in May 1945.
Mm-hmm.
Several months earlier, it became very apparent that Germany was going to lose the war. So I think, you know, because Gongol had never been a Nazi, he'd always been a soldier, but he'd never been a Nazi. Um, he thought to himself, this is pointless. You know, we're going to lose. He was a German citizen, although
Mm-hmm.
there, you know, when Austria was absorbed into Greater Germany, the German army had a lot of Austrians in it, and
Yeah.
several of his men were native Austrians, but he was a German. I think he just said, number one, this is pointless. And number two, because he was a good leader, he didn't want any of his men being killed for no reason.
Yeah.
And he saw the Austrian resistance trying, at that point in the war, they weren't blowing up railways. They weren't, you know, assassinating German soldiers. They were trying to protect Austrian civilians against the Waffen SS and the Gestapo,
Mm-hmm.
because you know, the German hierarchy had said that anybody who hangs a white flag out should be shot or hung from a lamppost.
Yeah.
And a lot of people in Austria were killed that way because they were waiting for the, you know, in this case, the US Army to show up. So I think Gongol was acting out of both pragmatism, but also out of a sense of humanity. He didn't want anybody, his soldiers, the VIPs, or Austrian civilians to get killed in what was by that point very obviously a pointless conflict.
Mm-hmm. And there are different accounts of the battle. So, how do you reconcile the different narratives in your book?
Um, it's actually so the benefit of World War II, if you
Mm,
can say that, is that there are millions and millions of pages of official documents
mm,
in archives in the UK, in Europe, in the United States. And because I had worked at the U.S. Army Center of Military History, I knew where the documents were. Fred Beck had given me a bunch of them. But then I spent, another 20 years researching. So I had a mountain of official documents. And we're talking about after action reports, op plans, operational plans,
mhm.
tactical plans. And the benefit of military communication before the internet is everything got written down. I mean, after action reports were done by the participants, literally in some cases within hours of the end of the fight. And so they may not have known the larger uh, strategic plan, but they know what happened to their unit. So the after action reports for the 23rd Tank Battalion and the 12th Armored Division and the 142nd Infantry Regiment all had this story in their
Mm.
reports. And then also I had these two direct participants from the 142nd Infantry who told me um, what they remembered. And even though their views of the battle were somewhat different because they were pointed in different directions, their overall knowledge of what happened was very much the same.
Yeah.
And it corroborated the after action reports. And then a lot of it is being able to sit down and make a chronology based on all of these different reports, American, German, Austrian, and even French. And bear in mind that people like Reynaud and Daladier wrote dueling, memoirs after the war, where they basically trashed each other. But at the same time, their descriptions of the fight were almost identical.
Yeah.
So once, having been trained originally as a journalist, I always work on the, 2 to 3 source concept that one person might be a story. If two people tell it who are not directly uh, next to each other or something, that increases the probability that the story is true. And when you get 3, 4, 5, 10 accounts of a particular incident that are all pretty similar, especially if they're from both sides of the fight, then you can pretty much go along with it. And there were certain chunks of dialogue that I literally took from these after action reports because the person writing the report would say, Captain Lee said, and he put it in quotation marks.
Yeah.
So it was essentially a direct quote from Lee or from, the commander of the 142nd or something. So um, putting the story or finding the information was the hard part. Uh, Putting it together, once you create a chronology of the fight, it's actually pretty straightforward. It's
Yeah.
it's like reporting a news story of any kind, but you have more colorful dialogue. So,
Um, what do you think that the impact of the battle did for the legacy of the French politicians who were held there?
well, I think we can say without doubt that had those VIPs died at Castle Itter, either
Mm,
killed by the 17th SS or killed in the battle, the post-war history of France would have been much different because, Paul Reynaud, Daladier, several of the other VIPs played major roles in forming the post-war government and assisting Charles de Gaulle in putting together, the government that he ran
mhm.
for years after the war. And in that sense, I think that Sepp Gangl and Jack Lee, by deciding to do this, to defend these people in this castle, actually helped determine the post-war history of France, and for that matter, the post-war history of Austria. And I mean, in a very real sense, we're still living with the aftermath of World War II. You know,
Yeah,
if you look at the tensions in Europe today, you know, why does Putin want Ukraine back? Because
yeah.
the Soviet Union owned it for years. So I think it's very very accurate to say that had the castle been taken by the SS and everybody killed, we would have seen a very different France and very probably a very different Western Europe after the war.
So if it was that important, how how is this story so small in the realm of World War II history?
Mainly because, you know, bear in mind, this fight happened essentially on the last day of World War II in Europe. You know, the Germans surrendered. Um, and the surrender went into effect on May 6th at 12 noon, I think, local time.
Mhm.
But all fighting had essentially stopped by the time the fight at Castle Itter was over. So what you have is the end of the most destructive war in human history.
Yeah.
And this was literally a footnote, because it involved, you know, very few American soldiers, even fewer German soldiers in this castle in a remote part of, well, not remote, but in a part of Austria that wasn't considered all that important at that point in the war. And there was so much else to talk about. On top of that, you know, Britain, America, and the European countries were just tired. You know, I mean, at that point, the war for America had gone on for 4 years, for Britain for 6 years. People didn't want to hear a whole lot about it right away. But later on, as we got farther away from the end of the war, people said, okay, we need to write the history of this.
Mm.
And again, they were talking about Pearl Harbor and Normandy and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nobody was talking about Castle Itter. So if Fred Beck had not started doing research on this, none of us would know about it. Really. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that the book, The Last Battle, is is the most complete story or the most complete account of the fight that you could have.
Yeah.
Um, Unfortunately, several people have plagiarized parts of my book, which happens, you know, I mean, it's the internet age. I just wish when they do it, they get the, you know, facts straight and the name spelled right, but that's a different thing. So, you know, I think that as we moved on, um, as I like to write smaller stories, but that still illustrate larger aspects, other writers do that too. You know, Alex Kershaw is a wonderful World War II historian, and he does much the same thing. He'll follow small groups, um, and it's I think it's because of small stories like this. For example, one of my books is about the last American killed in combat in World War II, and he was killed 3 days after the ceasefire between Japan and the
Ah.
United States went into effect. He literally was that guy that no service member wants to be, the
Mm.
last guy killed. A young man from Pennsylvania named Tony Marchione. Um, you know, it's those kinds of stories that I think can be much more affecting for the reader than, you know, this division moved 500 miles this way and did this and did that. And we all, you know, I think anybody who's a World War II, who's interested in the history of World War II will have read about Eisenhower and Montgomery
Yeah.
and Guderian and all those folks. But none of those guys were directly involved, you know, and as a former Army enlisted person myself, I tend to think that lots of times the best stories come from the lower ranks because they're the people, men and women, who tend to be closer to the actual fight. So it's, you know, I just think it's a small story that long deserved to be told, and I was just fortunate enough to be really the first one to tell it in detail. And I had fun doing it over 30 years.
That's what I love about this channel. I've got the big battles. I've got the World War, the Pearl Harbor in the Battle of the Bulge and stuff like this. But I want these little stories as well because these little stories are big stories,
Yeah.
really, that are just not told very often.
Mhm.
So
And
thank you for the book.
well, my pleasure. As as uh, as an aspect of this book, it is it came out, you know, 15 years ago or
Mm.
whatever. Ever since then, it's been what in Hollywood is called development hell, meaning it's been optioned, it's been unoptioned, it's been optioned, and it now finally looks like a major motion picture version of this book will go into production in February.
Oh
Uh,
wow,
Now, I say this guardedly because we've had definite start dates like four times.
yeah,
At this point, we have a very well-known director, a gentleman named Harold Zwart, who directed a movie called The Twelfth Man, which I commend to everybody. It's a true story about
yeah,
Norwegian resistance fighters. Um, he signed on board, and we finally have three very well-known actors, one American and two Germans, who have signed on. Now, not to be a tease, but I can't give you their names because
oh,
we're waiting for the news release to come out from the production company.
right. I thought I was going to get an exclusive then.
Yeah, well, once I know, you can know too. No, I mean, I know who these gentlemen are, and
Yeah,
it should be great. I mean, they would all be immediately known to you,
yeah,
including the Germans. And they have already done, you know, we know where it's going to be filmed. The film will actually be shot in northern Italy because
yeah.
they found a castle that's very similar in age and look to Castle Itter.
Hmm.
We've already got, you know, dozens of military vehicles, both American and German, lined up. We have all the uniforms we need. We have weapons. Everything is essentially set to go. And
Exciting.
um, there are, of course, always political issues that can gum things up. But
Mm.
as of right now, it looks like it's going to happen. So
Oh, exciting. I'll look forward to that.
I will certainly let you know if it does.
And what you mentioned the Austrian resistance earlier. What did they contribute to the defense of Castle Itter?
Um, they they were actually charged by Sepp Gangl with protecting Kufstein and the other little towns around from the Waffen SS and the Gestapo. But one young teenage member of the Austrian resistance actually participated in the fight for the castle.
Mhm.
And I later got in contact with one of his children, and he'd only heard bits and pieces of story. So that was helpful. The Austrian resistance, because it was so close, I mean, Austria was technically a part of Nazi Germany
Mhm.
following the Anschluss. So they were much more heavily policed by the Gestapo, the SS. And it was only really in the last year of the war that they were able to come um, out of the darkness and participate directly using weapons, some of which were supplied apparently by Sepp Gangl during the last few months of the war. Um, the story of the Austrian resistance really deserves to be told in English by
Mhm.
somebody who really knows the story. I read into it enough to be able to tell my part of it, but I would really love to see a really well done, comprehensive history, as we've seen from the French resistance.
Yeah.
Um, and I also wrote a book about how the French resistance helped a young American aviator who was shot down over Paris elude the Germans. And the French resistance is extremely well documented. Um, I would like to see the Austrian resistance and, in fact, the German resistance, sort of explained in that depth.
Mhm.
But it hasn't happened yet.
And how did the morale, especially the morale of the German soldiers, how did that change over the course of the battle?
Well, Sepp Gongol brought roughly 20 soldiers with him. Most of them were very loyal to him. They trusted him. They wanted to do whatever he said. So they got to the castle. They're, setting up the defenses, and at least two deserted first chance they got. They went
Hmm.
over the walls of the castle, which I'll tell you was not easy. I mean, this is a real castle. But there was a sally port down at the base of one wall that allowed movement in and out. And they just went over to the SS immediately. But the rest of the people stayed during the fight. Um, and I think it's more out of, loyalty to Sepp Gongol, and also again, the reality that Nazi Germany is already a smoking pile of rubble. So, you know, why continue that particular fight? Um, Now, ironically, once the fight was over and the American army arrived, all of these German soldiers went into a POW camp. So it wasn't like, the Allies were handing them medals or anything, but I'm sure they were probably treated better because, as you know, that I mean, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners were
Yeah.
taken in very short periods of time, and thousands of them ended up spending days, weeks, and sometimes months in open air POW cages, and
Yeah.
many of them died. I don't know whether the Castle Itter Germans were among them, but I hope not.
Because of the help that the German soldiers gave to the Americans and the French,
Mhm.
and the story that you tell, how has your book been received in Germany?
Actually, pretty well. Uh, because I lived in Germany, and at that time, I lived and worked in Germany from 1984 to 1989 at the headquarters of the US Army in Europe, in Heidelberg. And several of the civilians I worked with were older Germans. There was one gentleman named Eric, very nice man, then in his late 60s, a civil engineer. First time I met him, I walked into his office, and this is an American headquarters. And on his credenza behind his desk is this picture of this young man in a black Waffen SS uniform. And I said, Eric, who is that? He said, it's me. And I went, oh. So then, I said, so I suppose you only ever fought the Russians. He goes, oh, no, I fought you guys at Normandy, and we really kicked your behinds. It's like, oh, okay. But again, Germany after the war uh, went through a very, very difficult couple of decades. And ironically, I had just come back from Germany to the United States to go to work for Soldiers Magazine when the Berlin Wall fell. So I went back to Berlin and, watched the wall coming down and ultimately the removal of Checkpoint Charlie. And the people of what was still then West Germany weren't quite as excited by the reunion with East Germany as the East Germans were. And as I'm sure you may have heard, that a few months into the reunification of Germany, and in West Germany, you see bumper stickers that said, "Give us our wall back," because they didn't particularly enjoy having, Russian-made Trabants driving at 40 miles an hour on the Autobahn. Anyway, I think in Germany the book was well received. In France, it was very well received, despite the fact that it depicted these major French celebrities essentially as being pretty obnoxious to each other. But I also spoke with Paul Reynaud's daughter, and she gave me a lot of very good information. And again, the book was very well received. It just came out
Good.
in the 14th foreign language. A big Spanish publisher just brought it out 2 months ago. So 14 languages, including Mandarin Chinese, Hungarian, Estonian. I mean, it's a story that really captured people's imagination, not just in Europe, but pretty much everywhere.
That's excellent. That's excellent because it is a great book. So I'm happy for that. Um, why is it that because the battle is in the last day of the war? Why is it that the Germans carried on fighting when they knew it was over? They knew they'd lost.
Well, generally, the people who kept fighting were the ones who had always been the diehards. The 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division was highly motivated, to say the least. You still had random Gestapo agents, um, Waffen SS, small Waffen SS units patrolling, Austria and Germany. These were the people who believed if Germany was going to lose, then they should destroy as much as possible. And of course, there was still hope in the higher reaches of the Nazi party that there would be a Fourth Reich sometime. There was this whole myth of the final fortress in Austria, and that the mountains, they were so heavily fortified, and they had,
Mhm.
which was a myth, but it was a myth that a lot of Germans believed. So they felt that fighting, to the last man was the way to go. And of course, Hitler had killed himself rather than be captured. So the animating spirit of Nazism was, in many ways, a succeed or die.
Mhm.
And, although interestingly, after the battle, the Americans who started sort of taking control of the area found a lot of Waffen SS combat uniforms hanging from the trees in the forest nearby. Because these guys fought right up until they said, nah, maybe we don't want to die here. And they tried to melt into the surrounding area. Unsuccessfully in most cases.
Good. As a military historian, where do you think that Castle Itter sits in the whole World War II?
Well, I would be the first to admit that it's not up there with uh, you know the taking of Berlin, or I just finished a book that involves the liberation of Paris and what happened after that.
Mhm.
So Castle Litter is admittedly a footnote, except for the effect that it had on the post World War II history of France. Um, the effect that it had on the participants was much less successful, at least in the cases of Gongol and Lee. But the battle itself was important, but not important enough to be, in the top 25 engagements of World War II. But that doesn't make it any less important, or I hope any less interesting a story. Um, and I think that it's through these stories, as we talked about earlier, that people can really learn about the people involved. That's why Band of Brothers and a lot of the other TV and movie depictions of World War II were so important to help Americans who weren't even around during World War II, or Brits or French people or Germans, to learn about the reality of the people involved, or at least as much of the reality as would be depicted. And I think
Yeah.
that's why Itter's important, because it really is a unique story, that you had these two groups of enemies join forces to defend these French VIPs.
And I do think it's a very important story, and I think that the big stories are important, and I think the little stories are important as well. I think one could learn from every story about World War II.
Mhm. Absolutely.
And what do you
Uh,
think? Sorry, go on.
no, after you.
I was just going to say that finally, what do you think your book says about courage, and how do you think that it fits, the moral of the story fits in today's world?
I think the story it tells about courage, uh, the real core of that story is that courage is rarely something that that soldiers have throughout their service. Primarily, soldiers fight for each other.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I reported from Bosnia and Northern Ireland and Iraq. Fortunately, not as a soldier, but as a civilian. But it's always been true. Courage in most cases is just that you choose to do what you have to do in the moment, even though you realize that doing that can get you killed. I mean, it's soldiering is a very dangerous line of work.
Yeah.
And most soldiers, Audie Murphy once said that, he didn't really think about being courageous. He just did what had to be done at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And he managed to live through the process and become the most decorated American soldier of World War II. And that's true, I think, of any soldier. I mean, Sepp Gangl, it took a lot of courage for him to support the Austrian resistance when the Gestapo and Waffen-SS were still active. It took a lot of courage for Jack Lee and his men to throw in their lot with guys wearing,
Yeah.
German uniforms. But I think in terms of today, courage is a universal trait, even in the worst of times. Sometimes it's just harder for people to stand up and be counted than it is at other times,
Yeah.
which I think speaks to our modern age. So,
Well, the book, if I can pick it up, The Last Battle, is a fantastic read. I recommend that to anybody who wants to read about World War II. And I'll put a link, like I say, down below. And thank you so much, Stephen Harding, for joining me today. It was a pleasure.
oh, my pleasure entirely. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
For those of you still with me, thank you so much for joining me on this episode, and thank you so much for Stephen Harding. It was a pleasure talking to you, and it was another great conversation. I'm sure you'll agree. So, next week, we have Al Murray, who will be talking about Arnhem Black Tuesday. This is a fascinating book, and I can't wait to talk to Al Murray about it. So, as always, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.